It started as a simple plan, something I thought would be relaxing and harmless. I wanted to get away from the city for a few days, just me and the forest. I had been feeling the weight of stress in my chest for months. My sleep fractured and my mind always busy. I figured a solo camping trip could help me reset. I had done camping before, but always with friends or family. This time, I wanted complete solitude to test myself to find some clarity. I left the city early in the morning, my backpack packed meticulously over the past few days. I had food for 3 days, extra water, a small first aid kit, a sturdy knife, a map, a compass, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and my tent and sleeping bag. I drove for hours, leaving the highway behind, until the roads narrowed and eventually disappeared entirely, replaced by dirt paths that wound through thick forests. I parked my car at the trailhead, checked my map one more time, and shouldered my pack. The air smelled different here, clean, damp, earthy. Birds called in the distance, and the wind moved through the trees with a soft rustle. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The hike in was longer than I anticipated. The trail was uneven, covered with roots and rocks, and in some places barely distinguishable. I stopped several times to rest, drink water, and look around. The forest was dense, trees towering over me, their branches interlocking to block much of the sky. Sunlight came in patches, golden beams breaking through the canopy, lighting up dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Everything felt alive and quiet at the same time. I was acutely aware of every sound, the crack of a twig underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of wind in the leaves. I felt a strange thrill at being alone in such a place, far from the noise of civilization. By late afternoon, I found what seemed like a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream. The ground was relatively flat, and the trees around it were spaced in a way that provided both shelter and a view of the surrounding forest. I unpacked my gear, spread out my sleeping bag, and pitched the tent. I gathered firewood, small branches and dry leaves, and managed to get a fire going. The smell of burning wood filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest floor. I cooked a simple meal, and as I ate, I listened. The forest was alive, but nothing felt threatening yet. Just quiet, and the occasional sound of water trickling over stones in the stream. Night began to fall, and the forest changed. Shadows deepened, and the colors I had seen in the afternoon became muted, almost gray. The fire became my center, a warm circle of light in the dark. I lay in my sleeping bag for a while, staring at the night sky through the gaps in the trees. Stars were visible, far more than I could see in the city, sharp and bright, but the beauty of it only made the darkness feel heavier around me. I told myself I was being silly for feeling tense. I reminded myself I was prepared, that I had been careful. I fell asleep eventually, the sound of the stream lulling me, the fire crackling softly beside me. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a branch snapping somewhere, but it was too rhythmic, deliberate. A soft crunch, then a pause, then another crunch. My heart started racing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But then the sound came closer, moving around my campsite. I could hear it in relation to the fire, moving slowly, deliberately, almost circling. My first instinct was to stay still, to not make a sound. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to move too much, and flicked it on. The beam swept over the darkness, catching only trees and rocks. Nothing. I turned it slowly, shining it around the perimeter of the clearing, and saw a small shadow slip behind a tree. My stomach dropped. I felt a cold, heavy fear settle over me. This wasn't a deer. Deer don't make a sound like deliberate footsteps on dry leaves, circling a fire, waiting. I gripped my knife, my pulse racing. I thought about the car just a few hundred meters back, the path I had come in on. I considered fleeing, but I knew running blindly in the dark through the forest could be just as dangerous. I tried to listen carefully, trying to tell what kind of animal or human it could be. The sound stopped. Absolute silence. I strained my ears, waiting for the next sound. Minutes passed, I checked my map and compass in the dim light of the fire. If I stayed here, I was visible to whatever was out there. But if I ran, I could get lost in the dark. I told myself to wait, stay quiet, and assess. But my fear made every rustle, every whisper of wind, feel like it was getting closer. Hours passed, or maybe it was just one long hour. I wasn't sure. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. My body was tense, ready to react. At one point, I thought I saw a movement at the edge of the firelight, but when I shone the flashlight, nothing was there. My imagination was running wild, and I hated it, hated that I was letting fear take over. I reminded myself I had seen deer and small animals moving at night before, but deep down I knew this felt different. By the time dawn started to break, the footsteps had stopped. The forest returned to its usual sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals. I stayed in my sleeping bag until the light grew stronger. Then I unzipped my tent and cautiously looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, no signs of animals large enough to make the noise I had heard, no footprints that matched anything I recognized. The fire had burned down to embers. I felt a wave of relief, but also an exhaustion unlike anything I had felt before. I packed up quickly, every movement tense and alert, my knife strapped to my belt. I decided to break camp entirely and head back to the car. I didn't want to linger, didn't want to test my nerves any further. The hike out was long and slow. Every sound, the snap of a branch underfoot, a bird taking flight, made me flinch. I kept my knife out, ready to react. The sun rose higher, warming the forest, and with light came a sense of safety. I reminded myself over and over that the forest was not out to get me, that whatever had been there last night was gone now. Likely just another camper, a hiker, or maybe an animal I hadn't recognized. But the fear had left a mark, a tension in my body that I knew would take time to shake off. When I finally reached the car, I collapsed into the seat, my legs shaking. I started the engine and sat there for a long time, staring at the forest. I didn't feel the same peace I had expected from this trip. Instead, I felt a mixture of relief and a new respect for the isolation and unpredictability of nature. I thought about what could have happened, how quickly a simple mistake could turn into a dangerous situation when you are alone and vulnerable. The forest was beautiful, but it was not forgiving. It was alive, and it demanded awareness and respect. Driving away, I promised myself I would return someday, but not alone. Not until I had more experience, more preparation, and more confidence. I knew now that solitude in the forest was not the same as solitude in the city. There was freedom, yes, but there was also risk. And even when nothing tangible threatens you, fear itself can become a force, sharpening every sound, every shadow, until your mind convinces you that you are in danger. I reached the highway as the morning traffic began to pick up. The city looked the same, but I felt different. I was quieter, more aware, carrying the weight of the night with me. I knew I had faced something real, something primal, and survived. And that survival, that return to safety, felt like a victory in itself. From that day forward, I approached nature with a new mindset. I planned carefully, respected the environment, and never underestimated the simple reality that even the most peaceful forest can become a place of fear when you are alone. That night had been a trial, a test of patience, courage, and awareness. And although it had been terrifying, I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the delicate balance between solitude and danger. The memory of that night stayed with me, sharp and vivid, a reminder that nature demands respect, preparation, and humility. And when I finally returned to camping with others, I did so with a careful plan, a full understanding of the risks, and a deep appreciation for the forest, its beauty, and its silent power. That fear, though unpleasant at the time, became a teacher, guiding me to approach the wilderness with both caution and reverence, ensuring that every future trip could be enjoyed safely, with awareness and respect for the wild, untamed world around me. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't anything fancy. Just me, my old tent, my backpack, and the forest. I had always enjoyed being alone in the wilderness, feeling the quiet and the separation from the noise of the city. I thought I knew the area well. I had been there once before, hiking during the daytime. I figured a weekend camping trip wouldn't be a problem. I packed carefully. A sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and my map. I double-checked everything at home, making sure nothing was missing. I felt ready. The drive to the trailhead was long but peaceful. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forests with very little traffic. I parked my car in the small lot near the trail entrance and grabbed my pack. The first part of the hike was familiar and easy. The forest smelled of damp earth and pine. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in patches, casting long, moving shadows. Birds sang, and occasionally, I heard the distant crack of a branch breaking under the weight of a deer or some other animal. It was comforting, familiar. I followed the trail markers, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. I could feel the weight of the pack on my shoulders, but I had prepared for it, and the rhythm of walking slowly became natural. By mid-afternoon, I reached the spot I had chosen to set up camp. It was a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by tall trees that formed a natural wall around the space. The ground was flat, with a few patches of moss and soft dirt. I unpacked my tent and began setting it up. By the time it was standing, the sun had started its descent behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air had cooled, and I could hear the water trickling over rocks in the creek. I unpacked my stove, lit a small fire, and began preparing a simple meal of rice and canned beans. The flames of the stove cast flickering light across the clearing, and I felt a calm sense of satisfaction at being here, away from everything else. Night came sooner than I expected. Once I had eaten, washed my few dishes, and stored the food safely, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The forest around me was alive with sound. Frogs croaking, insects chirping, and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I had always known the forest could feel intimidating at night, but I had never really been alone like this. I lay there for a while, listening. Every sound was amplified in the quiet of the darkness. I told myself it was normal. Everything had its explanation. Animals, wind, branches falling. But as the hours passed, the quiet started to feel heavier, more intense, as if the forest was watching, waiting. Around midnight, I woke to a noise that didn't belong. It was soft at first, a distant rustling, but it had a rhythm to it. Not the chaotic sounds of the wind or a deer, but something more deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound was coming from the edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened. It was slow, measured, the kind of sound that made my stomach tighten. Something or someone was moving out there. I reached for my flashlight, careful to make no sudden movements. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. The rustling stopped when I turned the light toward it. I held my breath, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I started to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but my gut didn't agree. I had been camping long enough to know the difference between ordinary animal sounds and something else. Something else meant intent, awareness. I felt a prickling sensation along my neck. My chest tightened. Every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't alone. I scanned the darkness with the flashlight, slowly turning in a circle. That's when I saw it. A shape, moving just at the edge of the light, ducking behind a tree. It was large, taller than I expected for a human, but I couldn't see clearly. My mind raced, weighing possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone with bad intentions? My rational side told me not to panic, but the deeper, instinctive part of me wanted to flee. I decided to stay put. My first thought was to secure the campsite. I zipped the tent fully, grabbed a small knife I kept in my pack, and sat as quietly as I could. I tried to control my breathing, but it was impossible not to feel the fear coursing through me. The rustling returned, closer this time, deliberate and cautious. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling the clearing, moving slowly, testing the perimeter. I realized they were aware of me. My stomach dropped. I hadn't just stumbled on an animal. I had stumbled into someone else's awareness. I felt trapped, and the forest that had seemed so peaceful in the daytime now felt like a cage. Hours passed like this. I didn't sleep. Every small sound made me jump. The rustling at the edge of the clearing, footsteps crunching over fallen leaves, snapping twigs, soft brush against bark. I kept my flashlight close, shining it occasionally at the edges, but nothing was there long enough to identify. I kept imagining scenarios. Someone lost, someone dangerous, maybe someone hunting for trouble. The rational part of me tried to remind myself I was trained to be cautious, that I had a knife, that I could defend myself if necessary. But my hands shook, and my body ached from holding still for so long. At dawn, the movement stopped. The first light made the forest look almost normal again. I cautiously unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing was empty, nothing to show the previous night's activity. No tracks that I could see, nothing unusual except for a faint depression in the dirt at the edge of the clearing, like something had knelt there. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. My mind ran through every possible explanation. Someone passing through, watching, maybe even planning to wait for me to leave. I knew better than to assume I was safe just because daylight had returned. I packed up quickly, moving methodically, keeping an eye on the tree line. I didn't eat breakfast. I grabbed my bag and started down the trail, faster than I had ever hiked before. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense, but nothing else happened. The forest seemed normal again, almost serene, but I knew the danger could be anywhere behind me. Every few minutes, I turned to glance back, seeing only the ordinary forest, but I didn't relax. I reached the trailhead by late morning, exhausted, sweating, but relieved to see my car still there. The forest behind me looked peaceful in the daylight, almost innocent, but I knew what had happened. I knew I had been watched. I didn't report it immediately. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, and I didn't want to relive it by telling someone, but I knew I would never forget it. After getting home, I went over the entire trip in my mind, trying to understand what had happened. I realized I had made mistakes. Maybe the location was too isolated. Maybe I had underestimated the possibility of other people using the forest at night. I learned to respect that the wilderness isn't just beautiful and peaceful. It's unpredictable, and not everyone in it is harmless. I started taking more precautions for future trips, letting someone know my exact plans, carrying stronger means of protection, and choosing campsites closer to marked trails or areas with more daytime traffic. The experience changed me. I still go camping, but I am never naive about the risks. I pay attention to every sound, every movement. I learned that fear isn't always irrational. Sometimes it is survival, and sometimes the most important thing is to recognize danger, remain calm, and act carefully, even when every instinct is screaming to panic. I survived that night because I stayed quiet, stayed alert, and respected the unknown presence without confronting it. It left me with a deeper understanding of the wilderness, respect for other people's intentions, and a lasting vigilance that I carry with me every time I step into the forest. I had planned the trip for weeks. I was going to spend a solo weekend camping in the backcountry, far away from the roads, trails, and cell service. I wanted it to be simple. Just me, my tent, my sleeping bag, and the wilderness. The forest I chose was dense, filled with towering pines and thick underbrush, far from any human traffic. I packed carefully. Food for 3 days, water filtration, a small stove, extra batteries for my headlamp, a compass, maps, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife. I had been camping before, but this was my first solo trip into such an isolated area. The hike in was longer than I expected. My backpack was heavy, and every step on the uneven trail made my muscles ache. Branches scratched my arms, my boots sank into soft patches of moss, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. There was no one else on the trail. Birds chirped occasionally, but the forest was otherwise silent, and I liked it that way. It felt like I was leaving the world behind, and that was exactly what I wanted. After about 6 hours, I found a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The water was clear, and I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. I decided this would be my campsite. I dropped my pack and took a long drink from my water bottle, listening to the creek trickle over the stones. The ground was soft and damp, but flat enough to set up my tent. I cleared a space, moving rocks and broken branches, and began to set it up. The tent went up without much trouble. I pegged it into the ground and stretched the rainfly tight. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and organized my gear neatly along the edges so I could move freely. Setting up camp took most of the remaining afternoon. Once it was done, I took my stove and cooked a simple meal: dehydrated pasta and some canned vegetables. The smell of food cooking over the tiny flame made me feel a little warmer and safer in the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest changed. Shadows grew long and deep, stretching like fingers across the forest floor. The temperature dropped quickly. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the cold was biting at my hands and face. I zipped the tent closed, leaving only the small mesh vent open for air. The only sounds were the creek beside me and the occasional rustle of branches as animals moved through the underbrush. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the night. It was in the middle of the night, around 2 in the morning, that I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a distant snapping of twigs. I froze, trying to tell if it was an animal or a person. The sound grew closer. Something was moving toward my campsite. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I could feel the unease building in my chest. Every instinct told me that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my headlamp and switched it on, keeping the beam inside the tent for now. The light didn't reach far, but it illuminated the tent walls. The sound was louder now, a deliberate crunching of leaves and sticks, almost like something was pacing. I held my knife across my lap, trying to steady my breathing. I reminded myself that it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but the pacing didn't stop, and the noise didn't sound like an animal. Animals don't walk in circles around a tent. I waited, tense and silent. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped abruptly. Absolute silence followed, heavier than the night before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I lay there, my eyes wide open, feeling completely exposed despite the canvas between me and the forest. Morning came eventually. The first light filtered through the trees, a soft golden haze over the clearing. I unzipped my tent slowly, peeking out. Nothing was there. No footprints in the soft dirt. No signs of disturbance. Just the creek flowing gently and the forest returning to its normal rhythm. I felt foolish for staying awake all night, but the tension hadn't gone away. Something had been there, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to explore the area. The forest was thick, and the underbrush slowed me down, but I moved cautiously, my senses heightened from the previous night. About a quarter mile from my tent, I found something that froze my blood. Small footprints, human-sized, pressed into the soft earth. They were faint, but they followed the path I had walked. Someone had been nearby while I slept. The prints were irregular, like the person had been moving slowly, watching, stopping, and starting again. I returned to my camp quickly, my mind racing. I packed up what I could and decided I needed to leave, but the thought of retracing my steps made me nervous. I considered heading deeper into the forest to find another way out, but I didn't know the area well. I checked my compass and map repeatedly, trying to orient myself. The sun was higher now, and the forest was alive with birds and the sound of the creek. I reminded myself that most people in the forest were harmless, but I couldn't ignore the prints. I gathered my pack and began hiking back along the trail, keeping my eyes on the trees and the ground ahead. Every few minutes, I heard a snap behind me. It wasn't constant, just occasional. I didn't turn around, forcing myself to keep moving. My legs were tired, my shoulders sore from the pack, and my heart still raced from fear and adrenaline. I focused on my breathing and the rhythm of my steps. Hours passed. The trail twisted through dense forest, across small streams, and over steep hills. I kept an eye on the sun to gauge the time. My food and water were running low, and the thought of having to spend another night alone in the forest was unbearable. I pressed on, moving faster than I normally would, desperate to reach the edge of the wilderness. By late afternoon, I finally reached a clearing that looked familiar. The path ahead led to a service road I had passed on the way in. Relief washed over me. I picked up my pace, pushing through the last stretch of forest. The snapping of twigs behind me had stopped, and the only sounds were my own movements and the wind through the trees. I didn't look back. When I reached the road, I was exhausted, sweaty, and sore, but I felt safe. I sat on a large rock and took a long drink from my water bottle. I looked back at the forest. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but I knew it wasn't. Something had been there, watching, moving. I didn't understand why or who, but I didn't need to. What mattered was that I was out, and the danger had passed. I followed the road until I reached my car, parked at the edge of the forest. I unlocked it and sank into the seat, shaking from fatigue and relief. I took a few deep breaths and started the engine. I drove slowly, taking in every sound around me, scanning the edges of the road for any sign of movement. Nothing appeared. I was finally leaving the forest behind. Once I reached my home, I unloaded my gear carefully. I examined the footprints in my memory, replayed the sounds I had heard at night, and tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe a hiker, maybe even someone homeless living in the forest. I would never know for sure, but I learned something important. The wilderness was beautiful, but it could be dangerous, and being alone made every sound and shadow magnified. In the days after, I took precautions. I read more about solo camping, trail safety, and backcountry survival. I marked my maps with the area I had camped, never intending to return to that exact spot. I still loved camping, but I respected it now more than ever. I knew the forest was full of life, and life could be unpredictable. The story ends there, with me back in safety, reflecting on what had happened. I made it out of the forest alive, alert, and changed. I never experienced a confrontation, but the fear of being alone in the dark with someone watching me was enough to teach a lesson I would never forget. Every detail, the snap of the branches, the prints in the dirt, the chill in the night air, stayed with me. A reminder of the thin line between the safety of daylight and the uncertainty of the wilderness. I never camped in that area again, but I still camped elsewhere, more prepared, more aware, and more cautious. The memory didn't make me afraid to enjoy the forest, but it made me respect it. Every rustle of leaves, every creak, every shadow in the corner of my eye now carried meaning, and I carried the knowledge that while the wilderness is beautiful, it is never completely under control. The first sign that the trip might not go as planned came long before I even set foot in the forest. I had planned it for months, a solo camping trip into a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains. I had mapped my route carefully, chosen a site along a river bend I had found in old hiking blogs, and packed everything I thought I might need: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filters, extra batteries, a sturdy knife, rope, and a first aid kit that was more organized than my apartment. I left on a Wednesday morning, eager to escape the hum of the city, the constant background noise, and the people who demanded attention I didn't want to give. First, everything was perfect. The drive up winding mountain roads was beautiful. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the occasional deer crossing the road made me feel like I had stepped into another world entirely. I remember smiling as I parked at the trailhead, checking my backpack one last time, and stepping onto the narrow dirt path that would take me deep into the forest. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unreal at first. There were birds and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush, but no other humans, no traffic, no distant sound of machinery. I walked steadily, taking in the smell of moss and wet leaves. The trail was uneven, tree roots snaking across it like giant veins, rocks jutting out at odd angles, but it was well marked, and the map I had printed was precise. By mid-afternoon, I had hiked a good 8 miles, and my legs were tired but not sore. I found a small clearing near a stream where I could see the river's reflection through the thin canopy of leaves, and I decided to make camp there. It felt like a perfect spot, Flat ground, dry under the trees, access to water, and plenty of firewood. I unpacked slowly, taking time to set up my tent, clear debris from the ground, and arrange my gear carefully. I collected wood in several piles, sorted by size, kindling, mid-size logs, and the larger pieces I would need for the night. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, and I felt a flicker of unease, a sensation I tried to brush aside as natural. It wasn't fear, exactly, just a creeping awareness of how alone I was. Once the tent was up, I lit a small fire, just enough to roast some dehydrated food and boil water. The first meal was simple but satisfying. I had brought trail mix, canned beans, and instant coffee, all of which I ate while watching the light fade from the treetops. As darkness fell, I noticed the sounds of the forest changing. The birds had quieted, replaced by the occasional distant call of an owl or the rustle of leaves as something moved just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't help the way my eyes darted toward every movement in the shadows. I checked my knife, my flashlight, and the small camping stove one more time. Then I lay down in my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep, but the forest seemed to thicken around me. Every small sound, branches snapping, leaves crunching, made me tense. I kept telling myself that the animals were far away, that I was safe, but my mind refused to quiet down. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Around midnight, the first real trouble began. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs, soft but deliberate, coming from the direction of the river. I froze, listening. The sound repeated, a slow, careful progression, like someone walking through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a raccoon or a fox. But then I heard another sound layered over it. The scraping of something heavy against rock, followed by a low, dull thud. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quietly, careful not to make a sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing in slices, the firelight from the dying embers giving everything an orange hue. Nothing moved in the immediate area. The river's surface reflected moonlight in streaks, and I could see the trees swaying in the breeze. The snapping continued, closer now, moving along the edge of the clearing. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. There were very few people who hiked this trail in the middle of the week, especially at night. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't likely to be friendly. My first thought was to pack up immediately and leave, but the idea of stumbling through the dark forest unprepared seemed equally dangerous. I decided to stay put, making myself as small and hidden as possible in the tent, gripping my knife and shining the flashlight intermittently into the darkness. Hours passed with small movements in the underbrush, shadows shifting just outside the tent, but no clear figure appeared. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted in and out of restless sleep. Morning came slowly, the first light of dawn casting a pale blue across the forest. I unzipped the tent cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing was immediately visible. No footprints, no signs of other people. But the undergrowth near the river looked disturbed, like something large had pushed through it. I felt a tight knot in my chest, the fear of the previous night still lingering. I decided to break camp and move to a safer spot. I packed my gear efficiently, keeping my knife in my hand and my flashlight ready. I followed the trail along the river, watching for any signs of danger, and tried to focus on the beauty of the forest. The way the sunlight hit the moss, the sound of the river rushing over rocks, the occasional bird call. But the sense of being watched never left me. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow seemed to twitch with movement. I stayed on the main trail, avoiding shortcuts or unmarked paths, and tried to keep my pace steady. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small ridge that offered a view of the valley below. I stopped to rest and drink water, taking note of my surroundings. From this vantage point, the forest looked less threatening, more open. I could see smoke rising in the distance, probably from another campsite, and I felt a flicker of relief. I marked this point in my mental map, knowing it would be my fallback if I needed help. I continued along the ridge trail, my senses on high alert, but the immediate tension of the previous night had eased slightly. Late in the day, I found another clearing near a small pond. This spot was more isolated but had dry ground and enough firewood for a night. I set up camp again, this time taking extra precautions. I arranged my gear to create a small perimeter around the tent, using rope and branches to create a sort of early warning system. Every time I heard a rustle, I could glance in the right direction and see it before it reached the tent. I collected more water than I needed and filtered it twice, just to feel prepared. As night fell, I kept the fire larger than usual, casting long, protective shadows across the clearing. The second night was tense but uneventful, and I allowed myself brief moments of rest. I sat by the fire, eating, drinking, and listening to the forest, learning its rhythms. By the time the moon rose, I felt a little more confident, understanding how the wind carried sound and how shadows shifted in the firelight. I slept more deeply than the previous night, waking only occasionally to glance outside, my knife within reach, my senses sharpened by the memory of the first night. The next morning, I made a plan to return to the main road. I didn't want to linger longer than necessary. I packed my gear carefully, double-checking everything, and started walking early. The hike back was exhausting but uneventful. The forest, bathed in morning light, seemed almost friendly compared to the night before. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to drink water or rest briefly, always aware of my surroundings. By late afternoon, I reached the main trailhead, my legs aching but my mind clear. I felt a profound sense of relief as I saw the familiar sight of cars and other hikers. I walked to my car slowly, savoring the return to safety. I loaded my gear, checked the tires, and started the engine. As I drove down the mountain road, I reflected on the trip. It had been terrifying at times, exhausting, and filled with moments of real fear. But I had survived, and I had learned something about preparation, awareness, and the quiet, unpredictable dangers of the wilderness. I felt proud of myself for handling the situation responsibly, for not panicking, and for making decisions that kept me safe. I stopped at a small diner on the way home, eating a simple meal, the warmth and noise a comforting contrast to the isolation of the forest. I thought about my campsite, the sound of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the moments of fear that had made my heart pound. I knew I would return to the wilderness one day, better prepared and more confident, but the memory of those nights, the feeling of being truly alone and aware of every sound, would stay with me forever. It was a reminder that nature is beautiful but unpredictable, and that survival requires not only physical readiness but constant attention and respect. When I finally drove into my city street, the familiar hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the presence of people felt almost overwhelming. I parked in front of my apartment, unloaded my gear, and checked my supplies, making mental notes of what I would improve for the next trip. I felt an incredible weight lift from my shoulders, a mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. The forest had challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I had emerged intact, stronger, and wiser. That trip had been a test, and I had passed. The fear, the tension, and the long nights were behind me, and I carried with me the knowledge that I could survive, alone, in the most remote places. Even weeks later, I still remembered the sound of twigs snapping in the darkness, the feeling of being watched, the cool touch of the river's mist in the early morning, and the way shadows seemed to move in the firelight. Those memories didn't terrify me anymore. They reminded me that careful preparation, awareness, and calm thinking were the difference between fear and safety. I kept hiking after that, but I never took the forest lightly again. Every trip became an exercise in respect, observation, and planning. And each time I returned home safely, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had faced the wild, and it had not defeated me. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I wanted to be alone in the wilderness, away from roads, phones, and people. I wanted silence that felt complete, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every sound inside your head louder than it should be. I had chosen a section of forest in the northern mountains, a place where trails were sparse, and the trees were thick and old. The forest map I had printed was crude and vague, marking only the main trailheads and water sources, leaving much of the route up to instinct and exploration. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying my pack that weighed more than I liked to admit. It had everything I thought I might need: a small tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, extra food, a first aid kit, a portable stove, and a couple of books I might read by the fire. The trail started relatively easy, flat and wide, with patches of sunlight breaking through the pine canopy. Birds were calling, and I could hear a small creek off to the side. I hiked for a few hours, enjoying the calm and the solitude. As the sun began to dip lower, I realized I needed to find a camping spot soon. The forest was dense here, and most of the clearings were small and uneven. I found a slight depression in the ground near a large fallen tree, surrounded by older pine trees. It was not perfect, but it would have to do. I cleared some debris, spread my ground sheet, and set up the tent, securing it tightly. The light was fading fast, and the air was cooling. I gathered dry wood for a fire, careful to avoid dead branches that would snap too easily. My fire-building skills were average, and I spent more time than I liked trying to coax the first flame from the damp kindling I had found. Finally, I had a small fire, its orange light flickering against the darkening forest. The crackling warmth was a comfort, and I sat nearby, eating some of my packaged food and listening to the forest sounds. Night fell quickly. The forest changed dramatically in the dark. Shadows twisted unnaturally, and every sound became amplified. The wind rustled the pine needles overhead, and something somewhere banged against another tree, making me flinch. I told myself it was just a deer or a small animal moving through the brush. I double-checked my tent stakes and the knife strapped to my belt, a precaution that made me feel marginally safer. Around midnight, the first unsettling thing happened. I was lying on my sleeping mat, trying to sleep, when I heard a sharp cracking noise. It was the sound of a branch breaking, but it was too deliberate, too loud to be a random snap. It came from not far from my tent. I froze. My heart was pounding. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, shifting shadows. The crack came again, followed by the soft, heavy rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. I didn't move at first. My rational mind tried to calm me. Bears were common in this area, yes, but usually they avoided humans. Other animals, maybe a deer or a wild boar, but the size of the sound suggested something heavier. My eyes darted toward the shadows beyond the firelight. I could make out vague shapes, branches bending unnaturally. I sat up slowly, gripping my knife tightly. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had started. I decided to stay awake, watching the dark forest. Minutes passed like hours. Every little noise made me flinch. The wind rattling branches, the occasional distant howl, the scuttling of small animals near my perimeter. I tried to tell myself that I was being paranoid, that I had always overestimated danger in the woods, but the primal part of my brain screamed that I was not alone. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a slow, deliberate snap, then a shuffling noise closer than before. My fire had mostly died down. I grabbed a few logs and threw them on the embers, reigniting a small flame. The light illuminated the trees just beyond my clearing. I could see a large shadow moving between the trunks. My heart raced uncontrollably. It was massive, larger than any deer or boar I had seen, and it moved with intent, deliberately approaching. I realized then that I had to prepare. I had no gun, only my knife and the knowledge that making noise might scare it off. I climbed halfway out of my tent, trying to remain as quiet as possible while keeping my eyes on the shadow. My mind raced through scenarios. A bear was the most likely threat. I remembered reading survival guides. Stay calm, make yourself appear large, don't run. I grabbed a long branch that I had prepared for firewood and held it like a spear. The shadow paused, just at the edge of the firelight. I could see the outline clearly now. Massive, dark, hunched, powerful. It was sniffing the air, moving its head back and forth. I kept my breathing slow, steady, trying not to trigger it. I threw a small rock toward the edge of the clearing, hoping to distract it. The sound echoed through the forest. The shadow turned sharply, moving toward the noise. I seized the moment to slowly back into my tent, zipping it closed, hoping the thin fabric would provide some psychological barrier between me and whatever it was. The rustling continued around my tent for over an hour. My fire had gone out. I had no light. I lay flat on my sleeping mat, knife in hand, listening to the heavy breathing and occasional snapping of branches. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. Every instinct screamed that if I moved, I might provoke it. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. The forest went eerily silent. I waited until the first light of day, the gray sun cutting through the dense pines. Carefully, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were tracks, huge paw prints in the soft dirt, leading around my camp, not directly through it. Whoever or whatever had been circling had clearly sensed me. I realized that luck, timing, and my own caution had kept me safe. I packed my things quickly, leaving behind anything that could attract attention. I kept my knife ready and walked carefully toward the main trail. Every step was tense. I didn't hear the creature again, but I didn't dare relax until I reached the trailhead. It was hours of slow, careful hiking through rough terrain, constantly checking the shadows, listening for any sound that could indicate I was being followed. By mid-morning, I reached a wider, more traveled trail. I could see tire marks and footpaths that suggested other hikers had passed recently. I felt relief washing over me. I kept moving, maintaining a brisk pace. Eventually, I reached my car. The entire trip back to the nearest town was spent in quiet reflection, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the edges of the road. When I finally reached the safety of a gas station, I allowed myself to exhale. I had survived a night in the wilderness with a massive predator nearby, relying on nothing but preparation, instinct, and a bit of luck. That night had left a mark on me. Not fear of camping, but a deeper respect for the power of nature and the importance of preparation, caution, and awareness. I realized that survival often depended less on strength and more on patience, observation, and timing. I never forgot the sound of those heavy steps, the way the shadows had moved, and the silence after it had left. I returned home with a newfound appreciation for life, for safety, and for the invisible boundaries that separate humans from the wild. I continued to hike and camp, but always with a more careful plan, always respecting the wilderness, never underestimating it. That night in the forest had been terrifying, yes, but it had also taught me clarity. Fear can sharpen the mind, but preparedness and respect for the environment are what keep a person alive. I had made it through, and that knowledge, that clear understanding of my own limits and the dangers around me, stayed with me long after the forest faded behind me. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, meticulously preparing for every detail I could think of. My life had been hectic for a long time, and I wanted a place where I could be completely alone, somewhere far away from the noise, the traffic, the people. I had a map, a compass, and a rough idea of the trails I would take. I packed carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, fire-starting tools, a small stove, enough food for 4 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a multi-tool, and a whistle. I double-checked everything, then triple-checked, until I was satisfied I wasn't forgetting anything critical. The drive to the forest was long and quiet, and the farther I went, the thinner the traffic became. I left the main highway behind and took a smaller, barely paved road. The trees grew thicker on both sides, and the sunlight flickered through the leaves in scattered patches. By the time I parked the car near the trailhead, I was almost alone. A few hikers had passed by earlier, but they were gone, and it was just me and the forest. The air smelled sharp, earthy, and fresh. I felt a little thrill at being so isolated, but also a quiet tension, a sense that I was stepping into a place where I would be completely responsible for myself. The hike-in was steady, but my backpack was heavy, and the incline was constant. The trail twisted around streams and boulders, crossed narrow wooden bridges, and disappeared in places under dense undergrowth. I tried to memorize landmarks as I went, so I could retrace my steps if I needed to. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves. Occasionally, I spotted a squirrel darting across the path or a deer glimpsed in the shadows. Every small sound made me alert, but I reminded myself that I was trained for this, and I could handle it. By the afternoon, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was elevated slightly, with a gentle slope leading down to a shallow stream. The soil was firm but soft enough for my tent stakes. I took my time surveying the area for hazards. Dead trees that could fall, signs of animal activity, uneven ground. Satisfied, I set up my tent, making sure the rainfly was secure and the entrance faced away from the wind. I cleared leaves and small branches around it and set my backpack inside, arranging my supplies neatly. I built a small fire ring from stones I found nearby and stacked some dry wood I had gathered. The process was methodical. I wanted everything in place before nightfall. By the time I sat down, the sun was lowering, and the shadows in the forest had lengthened. I boiled water for a simple meal, eating slowly while listening to the quiet around me. As the sun dipped below the treeline, the forest darkened, and the night sounds became more pronounced. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. All of it created a rhythm I could feel in my chest. I went to bed early, thinking I would sleep deeply after a long day, but I did not. Somewhere in the night, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. A branch snapped, crisp and loud, somewhere beyond the clearing. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. I lay still, listening. Then another snap, closer this time. My stomach nodded. I tried to make myself calm, remembering my training. I had a whistle, I had a flashlight, I had ways to protect myself. But I also knew I had to be cautious. Panic could make things worse. I unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make noise, and peeked outside. The moon had risen enough to light the clearing, and shadows stretched across the ground. I could see the fire ring faintly, the stream glinting in the moonlight. Nothing moved in the clearing. Then I saw the figure. Not human, not exactly. At first, it looked like a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a large animal. Its eyes reflected the moonlight, sharp and bright, and I froze. I had read about bears in these forests. I had taken precautions, kept food sealed, hung it away from the tent. But still, there it was, standing just beyond the fire ring, sniffing the air. I froze. My mind raced. I could not make sudden movements. I slowly reached for my flashlight, keeping my body low and quiet. The animal turned its head slightly, sniffing again, and I could see its size now. It was massive, bigger than any bear I had imagined. My stomach dropped, and I realized the seriousness of my situation. I remembered all the advice. Stay calm, make yourself appear large, do not run, make noise to scare it off. But I also knew that improvisation might be necessary. I slowly backed into the tent, keeping my eyes on the creature. I grabbed the whistle and blew it sharply. The sound cracked through the forest, startling the animal. Paused, ears twitching, then charged. I stumbled back, barely managing to zip myself into the tent fully. The tent shook as it ran past me, claws scraping against the ground. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I sat frozen inside, trying to catch my breath, the sounds of it moving through my camp fading slowly into the distance. By dawn, I had convinced myself the animal had moved on. I unzipped the tent cautiously, scanning the area. My fire ring was trampled, some of my supplies scattered, but my food bag had been spared. I realized the animal must have been looking for food, and somehow my precautions had worked, at least partially. Still, the thought of being alone in that forest with such a creature made every step back to the stream, every snap of a twig, feel like a threat. I decided to break camp immediately. I packed quickly but methodically, double-checking that nothing was left behind. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it could hide a predator. I kept my backpack close, my walking stick ready, my eyes scanning constantly. As I descended the trail, I noticed the forest looked different in the daylight. Trees seemed taller, shadows sharper, every rustle louder. I had learned a new respect for this place. It was beautiful, but it demanded vigilance. Hours later, I reached a small ranger station I had spotted on the map. I was exhausted, shaking, but I was alive. I reported the incident, describing the animal as accurately as I could. They told me it was likely a large black bear that had wandered closer to the trail than usual. They warned me to avoid the area for the next few weeks until the animal moved on. I thanked them, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. By the time I reached my car, the sun was high, and the forest seemed almost serene again. I drove slowly, reflecting on everything that had happened. I had survived because I had been careful, prepared, and alert. But I also understood how quickly things could have gone wrong. The experience left me with a deep sense of respect for nature, for its power, and for the need to be ready for anything when you venture into the wild. Later, at home, I unpacked my gear, carefully inspecting everything. I repaired what I could, cleaned what was dirty, and made mental notes for my next trip. I realized that even with all the planning, the forest could still surprise you. I also realized that survival depended not just on preparation, but on calm thinking, quick reactions, and respect for the environment. The experience stayed with me for months. I would sometimes wake up at night, heart racing, imagining the bear's eyes reflecting in the moonlight. But over time, I processed it, understanding that fear was natural, but knowledge and caution were my allies. The forest had tested me, and I had come through intact. I knew I could return one day, but I would never forget the lesson I had learned. Nature is beautiful, dangerous, and always unpredictable. I kept hiking, kept exploring, but I was never careless again. I always remembered to respect the boundaries of the wild, to stay aware, and to prepare for the unexpected. Every trip after that felt different. I had learned a lesson that could not be taught in books or maps. It had to be experienced, and surviving that night alone in the forest gave me a confidence, a steady awareness, and a profound respect that would guide every step I took into the wilderness from that day forward. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The city felt suffocating, and I needed the silence of the forest more than anything else. I wanted to be completely alone, away from traffic, sirens, and people. I had picked a remote area I had found on an old map online, somewhere deep enough into the woods that I wouldn't see another human for miles. The plan was simple. Hike in during the afternoon, set up a small tent near a stream, and spend 2 nights out there, cooking over a fire, reading a book, and just feeling like I belonged to the world instead of the city. I had done solo camping before, but never this deep or this isolated. The first few hours of the hike were easy. The path was overgrown in places, but I could follow it well enough. Birds chirped in the trees, and the light filtered through the canopy in sharp lines. The air was cooler than I expected, and every so often I would catch the smell of damp soil mixed with pine. I walked slowly, carrying a pack with food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a small hatchet, and my sleeping bag. I told myself that the hardest part would be the first night. By the time I reached the clearing I had chosen, the sun was low. It was the perfect spot. A flat piece of ground surrounded by trees, with a small stream cutting across one side. I could hear the water rushing softly over rocks. I set my pack down and unpacked the tent, laying it out and carefully assembling the poles. I paid attention to every detail, making sure it was tight, level, and protected from the wind. Then I gathered sticks and small logs for a fire, making a rough circle of stones to hold it. I had a small metal container for cooking, a few cans of beans, and a tin of coffee. It was simple, but that's how I liked it. Night fell quickly. It was darker than I had expected. The forest had a way of swallowing light. Once the sun disappeared, I realized I could barely see a few feet ahead without my flashlight. The first night in the wilderness always feels strange. You notice every sound. The wind in the trees, the rustle of small animals, the cracking of a distant branch. My first instinct was excitement. This was exactly why I had come. But there was also a creeping sense of unease. Alone in a forest, every sound feels sharper, every shadow longer. I lit the fire carefully. Flames flickered across my face, making the shadows in the trees dance. I boiled water for coffee and cooked the beans slowly. As I ate, I tried to enjoy the stillness, but I kept hearing noises. A crack, a thump, the scraping of something across dry leaves. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer. They're common around streams. I tried to focus on the stream itself. Its steady sound was comforting, grounding me in a rhythm. Hours passed and sleep was difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard someone walking near the tent. Or maybe it was something bigger, something unseen moving in the trees. I tried to tell myself that I was just imagining it, that fear in the dark is like a magnifying glass for ordinary sounds. But the noises didn't stop. At some point, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing moved. Only the outline of trunks and the occasional glint of leaves reflected the light. I went back to my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself to sleep. That night, I woke up several times to the feeling that something was nearby. One time, I opened my eyes to see the faint glow of eyes reflecting in the firelight from the edge of the clearing. I froze, barely breathing. The eyes didn't move, but I could feel their focus. They were big, not like a deer, not like a raccoon. I stayed still for what felt like forever, and then they disappeared. The thought of bears crossed my mind immediately. I had heard that black bears sometimes wander into campgrounds at night, looking for food. I checked my backpack and made sure my food was hung high on a nearby tree branch, tied securely so nothing could reach it. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning didn't bring relief. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs close to my tent. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, but it didn't make me feel safe. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to hike a little away from my camp to feel less trapped. I packed my essentials and moved carefully along the trail, trying to keep my eyes on every movement. The forest felt alive in a way that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. I noticed broken branches, deep footprints in the mud that didn't look like any animal I knew, and distant sounds that didn't match the usual birds or squirrels. I couldn't be sure of what I had seen, and I didn't want to overthink it, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That afternoon, I returned to camp and decided to explore the stream. The water was clear, running fast over smooth stones. I knelt down and drank some after filtering it through my portable purifier. While washing my hands, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large had passed along the opposite bank, just glimpsed, then gone. I considered leaving immediately, but I wanted to stick to my plan. I told myself to be cautious, to make noise while walking, to avoid hiking in thick brush alone. The second night was worse than the first. The wind had picked up, and the trees were groaning under its force. The fire I had built was smaller this time because wood was damp from a brief rain shower. I sat as long as I could, staring into the flames, listening. There was definitely something moving through the forest now. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, came closer. I tried to remain calm. I grabbed my hatchet, keeping it close. I didn't want to fight anyone, but I needed to be ready. Hours passed with nothing obvious, and then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low growl, not animal-like, coming from behind a clump of bushes near the edge of the clearing. I shined my flashlight carefully. Nothing. The growl repeated, low, slow, like something trying to test me. I thought immediately of bears again. I remembered the survival tips I had read. Stay calm. Make yourself look big. Don't run blindly. I got up slowly and moved towards the tent, keeping my eyes on every shadow. Then I realized something terrifying. The footprints near my tent were not just animal. They were human. Big, heavy, dirty prints, and they weren't here yesterday. They led to my food stash and the back of the tent. Whoever had been watching me had approached while I was away. My heart sank, but I tried to stay focused. I didn't know if they were still around. I looked around, shining the flashlight, but there was nothing immediately visible. I stayed awake all night, sitting with the hatchet, flashlight, and a knife in my hand, listening to every snap and rustle. I barely slept. In the morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. The forest was no longer a peaceful escape. It was a trap. I packed everything carefully, making as little noise as possible, and started hiking back along the trail I had come. I kept my hatchet ready, my eyes on every tree line, every shadow. Every time a branch broke somewhere off the trail, I froze and scanned the forest. I didn't know if the person or people were still there, but I didn't want to take the risk. The hike out felt longer than it had been coming in. Every step seemed to echo in my mind, every sound amplified. When I finally reached the main trail, I could hear the distant hum of cars. Civilization, safety, relief washed over me in waves. I didn't run. I knew that running in the woods with someone following could be dangerous, but I moved steadily and without hesitation. By the time I reached the parking area, I was exhausted, dirty, and terrified, but alive. I locked the car doors and sat for several minutes before starting the engine. The forest receded behind me, silent and indifferent. I had gone looking for peace and adventure, but I had found something much harsher. The realization that some places are dangerous not because of myths, but because of real people, real animals, and the unpredictability of being alone in the wild. I didn't camp alone for a long time after that. I learned to respect the forest, to prepare for the unexpected, and most of all, to never underestimate the presence of others, even when the woods feel empty. That trip had been terrifying, but it had also taught me discipline, awareness, and patience. And in the end, I made it back safe, carrying the memory of fear and relief side by side, never forgetting the weight of being truly alone. I had been planning this trip for months, going over every small detail, every item I might need, and every potential problem I could imagine. I had never been a careless camper. Maps had been studied, routes memorized, weather forecasts checked repeatedly. I was going into the mountains, into a dense section of forest where few people ventured, hoping for solitude, a chance to disconnect completely from everything. I wanted the kind of quiet where the only sound is wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I had the usual gear: a high-quality tent, sleeping bag rated for cold weather, water filters, enough food to last a week, and a backpack carefully packed so that every ounce was necessary. Even so, there is a difference between preparation and reality, and I would find that out painfully. The first day was easy. The path followed a stream for a while, and the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy of pine and fir made everything look peaceful, almost unreal. I could hear my own boots crunching over fallen needles, the occasional splash of fish in the stream, and the faint rustle of squirrels or small animals in the underbrush. I kept reminding myself to conserve energy, to stay hydrated, and to watch for signs of the wildlife I knew existed there. Bears, mountain lions, or even just the smaller animals whose sudden movement could startle me. The air smelled of wet earth and resin, a smell so pure I could feel it fill my lungs. By late afternoon, I had found a small clearing near the base of a gentle hill, a flat space perfect for my tent. I unpacked methodically, staked the tent securely, and gathered wood for a fire. I didn't want to rely on just one source of light, and I knew that a fire could keep animals away if I kept it steady. The sun dipped lower, and shadows lengthened until everything seemed tinted a strange, heavy green, almost oppressive in the silence. That night, I woke more than once. There was the sound of wind through the trees, but it wasn't just the wind. I had the uneasy feeling of being watched, a tension I tried to ignore. I had told myself it was all part of the wilderness experience, that every rustle and snap of a branch was natural. But in the middle of the night, I heard something different, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the clearing. I froze, lying flat in my sleeping bag, heart hammering. The steps circled the clearing once, not fast, not panicked, just deliberate. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight under my pillow, trying to convince myself it was some large animal. But I knew animals rarely stepped lightly like that. By dawn, the steps had stopped, and the forest returned to its usual morning sounds. Still, I was shaken, though I tried to tell myself it had been imagination, that my brain had been restless after so much isolation. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I wanted to find a small lake I had seen on the topographic map, far off the beaten path. I packed my day's supplies, water, snacks, a compass, map, and extra batteries for my headlamp, and left my camp with the intention of returning before nightfall. The trail became less clear the farther I went. Trees grew close together, roots jutted out of the ground, and the undergrowth thickened. Every few steps, I had to move branches aside or step over logs that had fallen years ago. Birds that had chirped in the morning were replaced by silence, broken only by my own breathing and the soft sound of leaves brushing against each other in the wind. Hours passed. I followed a small ridge that seemed to slope downward toward the lake, trusting my compass and the faint trail I had seen on the map. Then, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud, human footprints, large, heavy, and fresh. I paused, heart racing. The prints were too deliberate to be random hikers. They were deep, almost as if the person was carrying a heavy pack. They were heading in the same direction as I was. I debated turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I kept moving slowly, careful not to leave my own tracks too obvious. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I had expected, surrounded by thick trees and uneven rocks. The water was cold and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I set down my pack, sat on a rock, and tried to calm my nerves. The footprints I had seen didn't seem to continue around the lake, and I convinced myself the person had moved off another way. I stayed for nearly an hour, taking in the stillness, refilling my water, and resting. But when I stood to leave, I noticed the footprints again, appearing on the far side of the lake, as if someone had been watching me the entire time and then circled to intercept my exit. My stomach dropped. I had left enough space between myself and anyone who could have followed, but the realization that I wasn't alone made my skin crawl. I didn't see anyone yet, but the forest suddenly felt dangerous in a way I hadn't felt before. Every rock, every tree, every shadow seemed like it could conceal someone or something. I didn't waste time. I retraced my steps as quickly and quietly as possible, trying to remember exactly where I had come from. My pace increased, my breathing heavy, muscles tense. By the time I returned to the small clearing where I had first set up my tent, I felt as though the forest had changed, grown more menacing in the span of a few hours. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going longer than usual, adding wood until the glow seemed almost excessive in the darkness. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I considered leaving immediately, but I told myself the forest was still safe as long as I stayed cautious. Then, I heard a noise that froze me entirely. Not footsteps this time, but something closer. A faint, deliberate scraping sound near the edge of the clearing. Something or someone was moving branches, dragging, testing the boundaries. I didn't dare make a sound. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly shined it toward the noise. The beam revealed a shadow moving through the trees, large, bulky, carefully staying just beyond the light. My stomach sank. This wasn't a random hiker or animal. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. The rest of the night stretched out like a nightmare. I stayed awake, the fire crackling, trying to make myself as small and hidden as possible in the tent, listening to the forest around me. Morning felt like a relief I had almost forgotten existed. I resolved to leave immediately, taking only essentials, leaving behind everything that wasn't necessary. I had always thought camping was simple. You pitch a tent, make a fire, eat some basic food, and sleep under the stars. I had gone on weekend trips before, and none of them had ever scared me. Not really. I liked being in the woods. I liked the quiet, the smell of wet pine after a rain, the way the wind moved through the branches like a slow, whispering wave. But that weekend changed everything. It made me realize how small you can feel out there, and how quickly things can go wrong when the woods are empty and you are alone. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon on a Friday. The air was warm for October, but there was a sharpness to it, a dryness that made my lungs feel awake as I loaded my pack. I had decided on a site deep in the national forest, far from the main paths. I wanted solitude. The plan was simple. Hike about 10 miles to a clearing near a small creek, set up camp, fish a little, read, and sleep under the stars. I had mapped the trail and marked my GPS points carefully. The hike started well. The trail was narrow, covered in a carpet of brown and orange leaves. The occasional bird broke the silence with a sudden flurry of noise before settling again. I moved steadily, my pack feeling heavier than I expected, but nothing unmanageable. I had my water, my food, a first aid kit, and all the standard supplies. I felt prepared. I should have known that feeling would be my first mistake. By late afternoon, I reached a small rise that offered a view of the creek down below. The water was shallow and clear, running over smooth stones. Sunlight glinted off the surface in tiny, fractured patterns. I decided this was a good place to set up camp. The ground was level enough, and the trees around provided some shelter from the wind. I set my pack down, untangled my tent, and began laying out the footprint. It was mid-evening by the time I had everything set up. The fire pit I dug was small but adequate, surrounded by a ring of rocks I had collected nearby. I gathered dry twigs and branches, checking them carefully for any damp spots. Starting the fire took a few tries. This part of the forest had been damp from a light rain earlier in the week, but eventually I had a steady flame. The warmth was comforting, almost hypnotic. I roasted a simple meal over the fire, dehydrated beef strips and some instant rice. I drank a small bottle of water and felt a growing sense of satisfaction at having arrived here on my own. The forest around me was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the soft trickle of the creek. I lay back on my sleeping pad and looked up at the trees, watching the branches sway, imagining the stories they could tell if they had eyes. It was peaceful, too peaceful in retrospect. Night came fast, the forest darkened, and shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. I kept the fire going, adding small sticks as they burned down, watching the glow of the flames cast shifting patterns on the ground. Then I heard it, a crunch somewhere beyond the circle of light. I froze. It was not a deer or any animal I recognized immediately. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. I listened, nothing for a minute. Then another crunch, closer this time, and the sound of something brushing against leaves. My first instinct was to tell myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a deer. I had seen both in this forest before, but the rhythm of it didn't feel natural. I stood, moving slowly toward the fire, making sure my flashlight was ready. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow column, and I scanned the trees. Nothing. The fire crackled, and I held my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. Another movement, this time from the other side of the clearing. My stomach dropped. It was not an animal I knew. The pace was human, but uneven, as if someone was stumbling or trying to stay quiet. I thought about calling out, but I remembered I had no cell service. The nearest road was miles away, and the ranger station would not be open until morning. I realized, with a cold knot in my chest, that I was completely alone, and if there was someone out there, I had no immediate way to reach help. I grabbed my small survival knife and kept the flashlight in my other hand. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The sound circled the clearing. I moved quietly to the edge, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever it was. My mind raced through scenarios. A lost hiker, someone drunk or reckless, or worse. I tried to convince myself it was probably nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and I fed it sparingly, trying to conserve the wood I had gathered. The sounds continued intermittently, always just outside the light, never revealing themselves. Sleep was impossible. I sat, leaning against a tree, exhausted, my eyes scanning the darkness. I noticed the temperature had dropped. My breath formed small clouds in the firelight. I realized I had underestimated the cold. My hands were numb, my legs stiff. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't stay outside any longer. I got into the tent, zipped it up completely, and tried to convince myself that being inside would make me feel safer. But the sounds followed me, rustling just beyond the tent, heavy footfalls, the subtle but unmistakable crunch of leaves. I imagined eyes watching from the darkness. Every shadow in the tent became a shape, every sound amplified. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay in place and hope, or try to leave and risk being caught. I had been planning this trip for months, going over every small detail, every item I might need, and every potential problem I could imagine. I had never been a careless camper. Maps had been studied, routes memorized, weather forecasts checked repeatedly. I was going into the mountains, into a dense section of forest where few people ventured, hoping for solitude, a chance to disconnect completely from everything. I wanted the kind of quiet where the only sound is wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I had the usual gear: a high-quality tent, sleeping bag rated for cold weather, water filters, enough food to last a week, and a backpack carefully packed so that every ounce was necessary. Even so, there is a difference between preparation and reality, and I would find that out painfully. The first day was easy. The path followed a stream for a while, and the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy of pine and fir made everything look peaceful, almost unreal. I could hear my own boots crunching over fallen needles, the occasional splash of fish in the stream, and the faint rustle of squirrels or small animals in the underbrush. I kept reminding myself to conserve energy, to stay hydrated, and to watch for signs of the wildlife I knew existed there. Bears, mountain lions, or even just the smaller animals whose sudden movement could startle me. The air smelled of wet earth and resin, a smell so pure I could feel it fill my lungs. By late afternoon, I had found a small clearing near the base of a gentle hill, a flat space perfect for my tent. I unpacked methodically, staked the tent securely, and gathered wood for a fire. I didn't want to rely on just one source of light, and I knew that a fire could keep animals away if I kept it steady. The sun dipped lower, and shadows lengthened until everything seemed tinted a strange, heavy green, almost oppressive in the silence. That night, I woke more than once. There was the sound of wind through the trees, but it wasn't just the wind. I had the uneasy feeling of being watched, a tension I tried to ignore. I had told myself it was all part of the wilderness experience, that every rustle and snap of a branch was natural. But in the middle of the night, I heard something different, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the clearing. I froze, lying flat in my sleeping bag, heart hammering. The steps circled the clearing once, not fast, not panicked, just deliberate. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight under my pillow, trying to convince myself it was some large animal. But I knew animals rarely stepped lightly like that. By dawn, the steps had stopped, and the forest returned to its usual morning sounds. Still, I was shaken, though I tried to tell myself it had been imagination, that my brain had been restless after so much isolation. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I wanted to find a small lake I had seen on the topographic map, far off the beaten path. I packed my day's supplies: water, snacks, a compass, map, and extra batteries for my headlamp, and left my camp with the intention of returning before nightfall. The trail became less clear the farther I went. Trees grew close together, roots jutted out of the ground, and the undergrowth thickened. Every few steps, I had to move branches aside or step over logs that had fallen years ago. Birds that had chirped in the morning were replaced by silence, broken only by my own breathing and the soft sound of leaves brushing against each other in the wind. Hours passed. I followed a small ridge that seemed to slope downward toward the lake, trusting my compass and the faint trail I had seen on the map. Then, I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud, human footprints, large, heavy, and fresh. I paused, heart racing. The prints were too deliberate to be random hikers. They were deep, almost as if the person was carrying a heavy pack. They were heading in the same direction as I was. I debated turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. I kept moving slowly, careful not to leave my own tracks too obvious. By mid-afternoon, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I had expected, surrounded by thick trees and uneven rocks. The water was cold and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I set down my pack, sat on a rock, and tried to calm my nerves. The footprints I had seen didn't seem to continue around the lake, and I convinced myself the person had moved off another way. I stayed for nearly an hour, taking in the stillness, refilling my water, and resting. But when I stood to leave, I noticed the footprints again, appearing on the far side of the lake, as if someone had been watching me the entire time and then circled to intercept my exit. My stomach dropped. I had left enough space between myself and anyone who could have followed, but the realization that I wasn't alone made my skin crawl. I didn't see anyone yet, but the forest suddenly felt dangerous in a way I hadn't felt before. Every rock, every tree, every shadow seemed like it could conceal someone or something. I didn't waste time. I retraced my steps as quickly and quietly as possible, trying to remember exactly where I had come from. My pace increased, my breathing heavy, muscles tense. By the time I returned to the small clearing where I had first set up my tent, I felt as though the forest had changed, grown more menacing in the span of a few hours. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going longer than usual, adding wood until the glow seemed almost excessive in the darkness. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I considered leaving immediately, but I told myself the forest was still safe as long as I stayed cautious. Then, I heard a noise that froze me entirely. Not footsteps this time, but something closer. A faint, deliberate scraping sound near the edge of the clearing. Something or someone was moving branches, dragging, testing the boundaries. I didn't dare make a sound. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly shined it toward the noise. The beam revealed a shadow moving through the trees, large, bulky, carefully staying just beyond the light. My stomach sank. This wasn't a random hiker or animal. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. The rest of the night stretched out like a nightmare. I stayed awake, the fire crackling, trying to make myself as small and hidden as possible in the tent, listening to the forest around me. Morning felt like a relief I had almost forgotten existed. I resolved to leave immediately, taking only essentials, leaving behind everything that wasn't necessary. I explained that I had been camping alone, that I had encountered signs that someone had been watching me, and that I had fled. He nodded again, gesturing toward his vehicle. I climbed in, my legs still unsteady, and we drove slowly toward the nearest town. The roads were rough, winding, and isolated, but with daylight and a sense of movement, my anxiety began to lessen slightly. By the time I reached the town, I was physically drained but relieved beyond measure. I reported the footprints and strange activity to the local authorities, who noted my experience and said they would check the area. They suggested it might have been a poacher or someone else moving through the forest, though no one had reported anyone missing or suspicious in that region recently. I knew that might be the official response, but it did not change my experience. Someone had been there, and they had been close enough that I could have been in real danger. The days following the trip were filled with lingering tension. I could not stop thinking about how vulnerable I had been and how quickly isolation in the wilderness could turn dangerous. I shared my story with a few friends who were experienced hikers, and they nodded solemnly, emphasizing the importance of preparation, awareness, and caution. I knew I would never go camping completely alone in such a remote area again, but I also knew that the experience had taught me something valuable about risk, instinct, and human presence in wilderness areas. Months later, I returned to the area, but only to hike during daylight hours, in a group, and on well-trodden trails. I kept an eye out for the footprints I had seen that night, but the forest had reclaimed every sign of human presence. Still, I remained cautious, always aware of the possibility that someone could be following, watching, or moving silently among the trees. The experience left a lasting impression on me. It was a reminder that nature, while beautiful, is unpredictable, and humans, while often unseen, can present real dangers. I had survived by staying alert, staying calm, and trusting my instincts. The fear I had faced was raw and immediate, but I learned that careful planning, preparation, and respect for the environment, and for other people in it, could make the difference between safety and disaster. I never camped in isolation again, but I still carry the lessons of that night with me. Vigilance, caution, and the knowledge that the wilderness is not just a place of quiet beauty. It is a place where being aware of every detail can save your life. Even now, whenever I plan a camping trip, I think back to that night. The stillness of the forest, the tracks near my tent, the sense of being watched, and the raw, unfiltered fear. I also think of the relief when I finally saw the road, the vehicle, and the other human being. That combination of terror and relief, danger and safety, has stayed with me. It informs every decision I make when I go into the wild, reminding me that fear, when respected and acknowledged, can be a tool, not just an obstacle. That night in the forest changed me, and in the end, surviving it and returning safely was the clearest proof I had of my own resilience. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I usually camped in familiar places, near well-known trails, but this time I wanted something different, something more isolated, where I could truly be alone with nature. I had spent hours poring over maps, looking for a secluded spot in the mountains far from roads, towns, and cell service. After much research, I settled on a small area near a remote creek in a dense forest. The area was marked as accessible by a narrow dirt road, but beyond that, I would need to hike several miles to reach my chosen site. I packed carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food for several days, a first aid kit, a compass, a map, a headlamp, and extra batteries. I double-checked everything, even weighing my backpack multiple times to make sure I could carry it comfortably. I left a copy of my plan with a friend, detailing my expected route and return date. Everything was set. I drove most of the day, following the winding dirt road that became narrower and rougher with each mile. My vehicle bounced over rocks and ruts, dust rising behind me. By late afternoon, the road ended at a small clearing, where a barely visible trail began. I parked my car, secured my gear, and started the hike. The forest was thick, and the trail was faint but manageable. I felt a mix of excitement and unease as I moved deeper into the woods. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine, wet earth, and decaying leaves. Birds chirped intermittently, and I occasionally caught glimpses of squirrels darting between trees. The hike was harder than I anticipated. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and loose rocks. My backpack pressed against my shoulders, reminding me that every step required effort. Several times I had to stop to catch my breath and drink water. The trail was more overgrown than I expected, and I had to push aside branches and vines that blocked the path. Around mid-afternoon, I came across the creek I had seen on the map. Its water was clear, rushing over smooth stones, and the sound of it was calming. I followed the creek upstream, searching for a suitable spot to camp. Eventually, I found a small flat area, surrounded by thick trees and shrubs, about 10 feet from the water's edge. It was perfect, hidden, private, and close to water. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground was level and free of rocks and sticks. I staked it firmly, checked the rain flap, and laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside. Once the tent was ready, I set up my small camping stove to make dinner. I boiled water for a simple meal of rice and dehydrated vegetables, eating slowly while listening to the creek. The forest was alive with sounds: birds calling, insects buzzing, and the wind rustling the leaves. By the time I finished eating, the sun was low, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. As darkness approached, I lit my headlamp to move around the campsite. I collected firewood, small branches, and dry leaves, planning to make a small fire later. I was always cautious with fire, aware of how quickly a forest fire could start, especially in an area like this. Once the firewood was ready, I sat quietly, watching the last light disappear and the forest grow darker. Night fell fast. The temperature dropped, and I pulled on a jacket. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, wanting to rest before the night fully took over. The first hours of the night passed uneventfully. The creek's sound was soothing, almost hypnotic, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals nearby. But sometime after midnight, I noticed a strange sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft crunching of leaves and twigs. I paused, listening carefully. The sound repeated, slowly moving closer to my campsite. My heart rate increased. I stayed still, holding my breath, trying to discern what it was. The sound of footsteps, definitely heavier than a small animal, approached through the underbrush. I considered the possibilities. A deer, a raccoon, a bear, or worse. I tried to remain calm. I knew that panicking could make the situation worse. I quietly unzipped my tent slightly to peek outside, keeping my body mostly hidden. The dim moonlight revealed vague shapes among the trees. At first, I couldn't make out anything clearly, but then I noticed a shadow moving deliberately, unlike a random animal. My mind raced. Bears didn't move like that, not with such cautious, intentional steps. The figure was large, human-sized. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there, moving closer to my campsite in the middle of the night. I debated my options. I had no phone signal, no way to call for help. I could stay in the tent, hope they didn't notice me, or I could try to scare them off with noise. I didn't want a confrontation, but I also didn't want to be caught completely unprepared. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly clicked it on, shining it toward the edge of the tree line. The beam revealed a man, wearing dark clothing, crouching slightly as he approached. He froze when he saw the light, staring straight at me. I realized I had to act. I didn't want him near my supplies or tent. I made as much noise as possible, banging a metal pot with a spoon and yelling loudly, hoping the sound would make him reconsider. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he bolted back into the trees, disappearing quickly into the darkness. My heart was pounding. I stayed inside my tent for the next hour, too frightened to sleep. Every sound, the creak, the wind, the distant rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I realized that I was completely alone, vulnerable, and miles from help. At first light, I cautiously emerged from the tent. The forest looked calm, peaceful, almost normal. I scanned the area, looking for signs of the intruder. Footprints in the damp earth confirmed my fears. Someone had been there, circling my campsite, searching. I knew staying was too dangerous. I quickly packed my gear, making sure not to leave anything behind that could be used by the intruder. I moved quietly, trying to avoid leaving obvious tracks of my own. The plan was simple: hike out to the nearest road as fast as possible. The hike back was exhausting. My body was tense, muscles tight from adrenaline and lack of sleep. I moved quickly but cautiously, constantly scanning the forest for movement. Every shadow, every sound made my heart race. I kept my flashlight ready, even though it was broad daylight. I stayed close to the creek, following the water downstream, hoping it would lead me toward the dirt road. Hours passed, my legs burning, sweat dripping from my forehead. I tried to focus on breathing, taking one step at a time, remembering every technique I had learned for staying calm under pressure. Eventually, I heard the distant sound of a vehicle. Relief washed over me. I emerged from the forest onto the dirt road, my backpack torn and dirty, clothes soaked with sweat and mud, but I was safe. I ran toward the road, waving at the passing car until it stopped. The driver, seeing my state, helped me load my gear and drove me to the nearest town. I reported the incident to the local authorities, giving a full description of the intruder and the location of my campsite. They took my statement seriously and assured me they would patrol the area. After that day, I stayed far away from that forest. I didn't return for several years, and when I finally did, I went only with a group and made sure to camp in well-populated areas. The experience taught me to respect the wilderness not only for its natural dangers, but for its unpredictability with other humans. The forest had been beautiful, peaceful, and serene, but it had also been a trap for someone unprepared, someone alone and vulnerable. I realized that preparation, awareness, and caution were the only things that could protect me. Looking back, I see now that my careful planning saved me. My decision to choose a remote location, my preparation for the hike, and even my knowledge of the terrain gave me the tools to survive. Yet, I also learned that even with all the planning in the world, one small mistake or bad judgment could have turned that night into a tragedy. That forest remains a place of beauty in my mind, but also a place of memory, a reminder that isolation in nature is a double-edged sword. In the weeks and months after, I slowly rebuilt my confidence. I resumed camping, but with new habits. I chose locations with more visibility, stayed closer to populated trails, and always kept my gear ready for emergencies. I researched local wildlife, human behavior patterns, and safety protocols in wilderness areas. I shared my story with friends, hikers, and campers, hoping to warn them, to prevent someone else from finding themselves in the same situation. Even now, when I camp in remote areas, I never forget that night. I always check my surroundings, move cautiously, and remain vigilant. I learned that fear, when managed carefully, can be a guide, an instinct that keeps you alive. That night changed the way I approach nature, solitude, and personal safety. It taught me the value of preparation, the fragility of human safety, and the importance of respecting both the wilderness and the unpredictable nature of other people. The forest had tried to intimidate me, to trap me in its silent darkness, but I survived. I emerged tired, shaken, and aware, but alive. And for me, that was the only ending that mattered. I knew now that being prepared, alert, and cautious was not paranoia, it was survival. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, carefully choosing a remote spot deep in the mountains that few people ever visited. The map I had used to pick the location showed nothing but endless forest and the occasional trail marker from decades ago. I wanted isolation, a break from the constant noise of the city, from people's demands, and from my own restless thoughts. I had packed meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, food, first aid kit, extra clothes, and enough survival gear to last me at least a week if something went wrong. I told myself that being prepared was the key to feeling safe, but I also knew that being alone in the wilderness always carries risks. The hike took longer than I expected. The trail was overgrown, with fallen trees and thick underbrush slowing my pace. The sun was low when I finally reached a small clearing near a narrow stream, its water surprisingly clear and cold. I set up my tent on the flattest piece of ground I could find, anchoring it carefully against the uneven terrain. I arranged my gear, checked my stove and water filter, and settled in for the night. The forest around me was quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire, trying to convince myself that the warm glow and flickering flames would keep me safe. I prepared a simple meal: instant rice mixed with dried vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet solitude. It wasn't until I finished and leaned back against a tree stump that I realized how intense the silence had become. The forest, which had seemed welcoming in daylight, now felt like it was closing in around me. Every shadow from the firelight stretched in odd, unnatural ways, and every small sound seemed amplified. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking my gear, double-checking the tent stakes, making sure I had everything I needed for the night. But then I noticed something strange. Small footprints in the dirt near the stream, fresh and unmistakably human. I froze, my heart starting to race. They weren't large, maybe a man or a woman who had walked through the area earlier, but there was something about their pattern. It didn't follow the usual path people take to reach water. It was as if someone had wandered near my camp and then stopped abruptly, turned, and walked back. I spent the next hour on high alert, listening and watching, trying to convince myself that it was just an old hiker, someone passing through who hadn't meant any harm. I told myself it was nothing, that I had my tent and my fire, and I was alone. Yet, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. My imagination began filling in details I could not know. Maybe someone was out here watching me. Maybe they were waiting for me to sleep. I told myself to calm down, that fear was dangerous here. But sleep became impossible. Around midnight, I noticed something else. My fire had dwindled to embers, and I could no longer see beyond the clearing. The forest seemed to have absorbed every sound, every shadow, except for one faint movement I thought I saw at the edge of the clearing. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it made my stomach knot. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting upright in my sleeping bag, listening intently. Occasionally, I heard distant, crunching footsteps, deliberate, slow, and irregular. My pulse raced with each sound, and I considered leaving, packing up in the dark and trying to hike back to safety. But the idea of moving through that forest at night, unarmed and disoriented, was terrifying. I stayed put, gripping a sturdy stick I had broken off from a nearby tree. Morning came slowly, the sky a dull gray as fog clung to the trees. I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. I had barely slept, and my eyes were raw from strain, but daylight brought clarity. I surveyed the area and realized the footprints from the previous night were still visible, leading toward my tent and then away in several directions. There were also marks I hadn't noticed before, scuff marks around my tent stakes, as if someone had tested the firmness of my shelter. Panic set in, but I forced myself to breathe slowly and think clearly. I checked my gear. Nothing seemed missing, nothing obviously disturbed. Whoever had been here had not entered my tent, which was a small comfort. I decided to pack up immediately. I did not want to risk staying another night. As I gathered my gear, I noticed a pattern. Broken branches and flattened underbrush leading down a slope toward a creek. I realized whoever had been here might still be nearby, possibly following the trail I had taken. My mind raced as I moved quickly but cautiously, scanning the trees and undergrowth. Every sound seemed magnified. A bird taking flight, the wind through leaves, even the distant trickle of water. I kept my stick ready, and I could not shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching. Hiking out was difficult. The trail was steep and slippery from recent rain, and my exhaustion made every step dangerous. I kept glancing back, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. Occasionally, I thought I saw a shadow moving parallel to me, but each time I stopped to look more closely, it disappeared. My anxiety grew with each passing hour. I knew that panic could make me make mistakes, so I forced myself to slow my breathing, to focus on the ground in front of me and the direction I needed to go. At midday, I reached a small ridge where I could see a dirt road in the distance. My relief was immense. It meant civilization, safety, and help if I needed it. I descended carefully, my legs trembling from both exertion and fear. As I approached the road, I saw a vehicle parked, an older model SUV, and a man standing nearby. He looked at me with surprise, probably wondering why someone was coming out of the forest looking like I had survived a storm. I waved my hand weakly, and he nodded, signaling me toward the road. I stepped onto the dirt, my body shaking uncontrollably, and he greeted me without words, just a concerned expression. I had always liked the idea of camping alone. The solitude, the fresh air, and the chance to disconnect from the noise of the city called to me. For weeks, I planned a trip to a remote section of a national forest, one that was far off the beaten path. I picked a location deep into the woods, where few people went, and where the trails were rough and unmarked. I wanted a challenge, and I wanted the sense of isolation that only comes when you are entirely alone in the wilderness. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I might need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a backpack filled with food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a headlamp, extra batteries, a map, a compass, and a small but sharp survival knife. I also brought a portable stove and a metal pot, enough to cook simple meals without firewood if necessary. I planned to hike in during the day, set up camp before nightfall, and spend at least 3 nights in complete solitude. The drive to the trailhead was long and quiet. As I left the highway and drove along the gravel road that led to the forest, the city noises fell away, replaced by the faint rustle of trees in the wind and the occasional chirp of birds. When I finally parked, the sun was still high in the sky, and the air smelled clean and earthy. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and started down the narrow, overgrown trail. The hike in was harder than I expected. The path was uneven, covered in roots and loose rocks, and in some places almost invisible. Every few minutes, I stopped to check my compass and map, making sure I was heading in the right direction. The forest was dense, tall pines and thick underbrush surrounding me on all sides. Occasionally, I saw signs of wildlife. Tracks in the dirt, small piles of scat, and chewed leaves, but nothing that seemed threatening. I felt a mix of excitement and tension, a heightened awareness that comes with being alone in the wilderness. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, a flat area to pitch my tent, close to water, and surrounded by trees that provided some shelter from the wind. I unpacked my gear and set up my tent with methodical care, making sure every stake was secure and the rainfly was tight. The smell of fresh pine and damp earth filled my senses, and for a moment I felt completely at peace. I took off my pack and sat on a rock, drinking some water and eating a small snack. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area around my camp. I noticed how quiet it was. No cars, no planes, only the sounds of the forest. A pair of squirrels darted through the trees, and a hawk circled above, its shadow moving over the clearing. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I returned to my campsite, collected some dry wood for a fire, and lit the stove to make dinner. The smell of rice and beans cooking filled the small clearing. I felt satisfied, tired, and happy to be here, alone but safe. Night came quickly. The temperature dropped, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. I had positioned my tent so that I could see the stars through a small opening in the mesh top. The sky was clear, and the Milky Way stretched across it in a dazzling display. For a while, I lay there thinking about how far from civilization I was, feeling a mixture of awe and vulnerability. Around midnight, I woke to a rustling sound outside the tent. My heart rate jumped. I listened carefully. The sound was faint, like leaves being disturbed, soft but deliberate. I held my flashlight in my hand and considered stepping out, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. The forest was alive at night. Deer, raccoons, and even bears moved around in search of food. I tried to calm myself and rolled over, pretending to go back to sleep, but my mind refused to settle. The rustling continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. I never saw anything, but I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. My imagination started to run wild. What if it was a wild animal? Predator? Bears were not uncommon in this forest, and I knew they could be dangerous. I checked my knife, made sure it was within reach, and listened. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I managed to get a few hours of restless sleep. The next morning, I packed a small breakfast and decided to explore further along the stream. The terrain was tricky. Steep inclines, slippery rocks, and tangled roots, but I moved carefully, enjoying the solitude. I saw more signs of wildlife, including deer tracks and claw marks on a tree. Around midday, I noticed something unusual. A faint trail of footprints that did not look like any animal I had seen. They were too large to be raccoons or foxes, and they appeared human, but I had not expected anyone else to be in this part of the forest. Packing was tense, my hands trembling slightly as I folded sleeping bag and rolled up the tent. I left everything else carefully arranged so that it would not create unnecessary noise or signals. As I stepped out, I noticed that some of my tent stakes had been moved, and the ground around the clearing was trampled. Someone had been there in the night, had circled my camp, and I had not seen them. Panic set in, but I forced myself to breathe, to think logically. I had a map, a compass, and a trail I could follow. I didn't look back as I began to hike down the ridge toward the main trail. My pace was brisk but careful, every sound making me flinch. I saw more footprints, following in parallel with mine, sometimes crossing paths, disappearing, reappearing. The fear was unbearable, but I reminded myself that daylight helped, and I had a way to leave this place. I just had to make it there safely. Hours passed. I encountered difficult terrain. Steep inclines, thick underbrush, and sudden drops where roots twisted into treacherous steps. My backpack felt heavier than ever. Every sense was alert. I could hear faint sounds of movement, but the forest was deceptive. Shadows, rustling leaves, and wildlife sounds made it impossible to distinguish reality from paranoia. My legs ached, sweat dripped down my back, and my throat was dry. I knew I had to keep going. I told myself if I made it to the trailhead by evening, I could call for help. I could be safe again. But as I moved, I noticed something strange. The footprints had multiplied, crossing paths, and the spacing suggested more than one person. My chest tightened. This wasn't a single follower, it was multiple people, and they were patient, careful, matching my pace in some way. I realized I could not outrun them through the forest. I had to outthink them. I found a narrow stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a clearer path. The water was shallow, muddy, and cold on my boots, but it masked my own footprints to some extent. The forest around me grew denser, the light dimmer, but I didn't dare stop. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a fallen tree forming a natural bridge across a steep ravine. I hesitated, balanced carefully on the slick wood, and made it across, heart pounding. On the other side, I noticed signs of recent human presence. Scraps of paper, flattened foliage, broken branches, definite proof that people had been in these woods before me. My fear intensified. Whoever was following me was experienced, familiar with the terrain, and capable of tracking without leaving obvious signs. I felt the weight of being hunted, not in a cinematic way, but as a very real, tangible threat. Every step became a calculated risk, every pause a potential mistake. I pressed on until I reached a ridge I recognized from the map. From there, I could see the faint glimmer of the main trail below, a wide path used by hikers and possibly park rangers. Relief was mixed with caution. I knew I wasn't safe until I reached other people. Moving carefully, I descended. Then I heard it. A shout, low, angry, human. Someone was trying to intimidate me, or perhaps signal to the others following. I froze for a moment, then realized I needed to move. I sprinted down the slope, zigzagging to avoid being an easy target, branches tearing at my clothing and skin, the underbrush slowing me, tripping me. My lungs burned, muscles screamed, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, I reached the trailhead. I could see a small parking lot, cars, a faint hum of engines and distant voices. People. I stumbled out of the forest, mud-covered, scratched, shaking violently, but alive. I reached a car, used a phone I had kept off in case of emergency, and called the local authorities, explaining the situation. Rangers and police arrived quickly, combing the forest, but they found nothing. No one had been caught, no traces remained other than the footprints I had seen. I told myself it didn't matter. I was safe now, and that was enough. I stayed near the trailhead for the night, refusing to return to the forest. The following days were a blur of reporting, interviews, and writing statements. I had my gear, my body, and my mind, and I carried the lingering tension of the forest in my muscles. I never returned to that area, and I never camped alone in such remote woods again. The experience left me shaken, but alive. I learned that preparation is necessary, but not enough. The wilderness is unpredictable, and humans can be just as dangerous as nature itself. I left the mountains with a clearer understanding of fear, of survival, and of the thin line between solitude and being hunted. The clarity came slowly, but eventually, I realized I had survived because I had stayed alert, calm, and rational in the face of a very real threat. That day, I had survived not by chance, but by careful thinking, awareness, and determination. I waited until the faintest hint of dawn, when light began to seep through the trees. The forest looked calm again, deceptively so. I packed my gear carefully, making as little noise as possible, and started the hike back toward the trailhead. Every step felt tense. Every snapping branch or falling leaf made me jump. I kept my eyes on the path, trying not to look into the deeper shadows of the forest. It took hours to reach the main trail, and the further I walked, the more I realized how isolated I had been. The clearing by the creek, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt like a trap. I finally reached the gravel of the main trail and felt an immense sense of relief. Soon, I heard voices, other hikers, and finally, the sound of cars on the distant road. I was safe. The experience left me shaken. I had underestimated how vulnerable one could feel in the woods. I had learned that even a small miscalculation, like underestimating the remoteness of the site or assuming that sounds in the night were harmless, could escalate fear to something visceral. I never saw anyone that night, and maybe I never would, but the memory of those heavy steps, the rustling just beyond the firelight, stayed with me. When I finally reached my car, parked at the trailhead, I collapsed into the seat and sat there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I realized that camping was not just about enjoying nature. It was about respecting it, about knowing your limits, and being aware that isolation could bring real danger, whether from the environment, animals, or other humans. I never returned to that creek. I never took that trail alone again. But I didn't stop camping. I learned to plan more carefully, to stick to trails that were frequented, to carry a personal GPS beacon, to trust my instincts. And most importantly, I learned that fear is not always irrational. It is often a signal, a warning. That weekend, I understood fear in a way I never had before. It was sharp, immediate, and completely real. Years later, I still think about that night sometimes. Not the forest in general, not the beauty of the creek or the stars, but the crunch of footsteps in the darkness, the feeling of being watched when you are truly alone. It changed the way I approached the outdoors forever. And while I continued to explore the wilderness, I never again took the sensation of isolation lightly. That night had taught me the importance of caution, preparation, and respect for the unknown. Because in the woods, there is no magic, no fairy tale ending. There is only reality. And reality, when you are alone, can be terrifying.